36 points between the top three in the championship, 1 point between the top two in the championship. With four races to go and two sprint races left, who do you think will be world champion in 2025? Will it be Max Verstappen sitting on 321 points, Oscar Piastri 356 points, or will it be the most recent championship leader, Lando Norris, on 357? Well, that's what I'm going to discuss in today's video about what kind of permutations we could see from the top sort of three positions in the last four races and how that's going to affect who will be world champion and who, in my opinion, is the most likely to be world champion. And so we'll start this off with the most logical thing of what does Max Verstappen need to do to win this championship? In a perfect scenario where he wins every single race, every single sprint race, he needs to catch up a 36-point deficit. And if he wins all of these races and finishes second in all of them, which I'm not saying is likely, but is what could happen, and mathematically is what could happen, um, out of that 36 points he needs, unfortunately only gets 30 of those and would not become world champion. So it is clear from this and needs to be mentioned that this is not going to be easy for Max Verstappen. And he needs misfortune for Lando Norris or poor form for Lando Norris in order to win this championship. That is the most important thing to remember about this because it, even if he does the most perfect end of the season possible, he can still be stopped by Lando doing the same by finishing in second every race. But with that to the side, I think I've laid out some possible scenarios and likely scenarios of what could happen in these last four races. I'd like to preface that I'm not going to include sprint races in this because realistically the point swings are very, very low, and the way that these championship orders turn out, which you might be surprised by, is the point gap with those sprint races doesn't really get affected too much, assuming that the drivers finish close to each other, which I am. We could get another Austin situation, but in that case, I could just predict that the McLaren's DNF in every race. I think that's unrealistic to predict, and I think the point swings in the sprint races are kind of they can be factored in at the end if you want to, but I'm not including them right now. But as you can see in front of you, I've laid out three different likely scenarios of what could happen in these coming races. And starting with the first scenario, this is the situation that I see happening most likely. I think this is what we would most likely see in the rest of this season, based off of current form and previous form at the tracks. So, starting with Interlagos, I've included the sprint qualifying results in the top left, as you can see. And the reason I've done this for last year's results is because you can't guarantee Sao Paulo is going to be a rainy race again, and the sprint qualifying was in dry conditions, and I think is quite representative of what the pace of each car was last year, with some slight exceptions. And you'll see this in all of the tracks going on, where I use qualifying as a reference, because in this era of Formula One, where you qualify is largely going to impact where you finish in a race. So that's why I weight qualifying results last year more than I do race results. Um, but beyond that, as you can see, this is the first scenario I see happening this year where I believe Max Verstappen will win the race. McLaren have very strong form here, which is why I've put both on the podium. And again, you could make arguments for Piastri being lower down, um, but I do think he will get some sort of momentum back. I don't think he's that bad that in a car that really should suit Interlagos, I don't think he's going to be finishing all the way down in P7, P5, P6. I think it's quite reasonable to say he finishes third in this race, even if he doesn't qualify there. I think third place is quite reasonable. Um, and then, of course, Lando Norris and Max Verstappen, second and first. I do believe that it's going to be very close between these two. I'm not super confident that Max is going to sweep this weekend. I think it will be close between the two, but I think Max will just edge it out. And as you can see, you'll see this little table in all of the weekends forthcoming. This shows what the championship would look like if this happened. And if this happened, not much really changes because you've got Max gaining the biggest points, but both McLaren drivers sitting on the podium, which again I think is quite a reasonable prediction for Interlagos. This is quite likely to happen because Ferrari haven't been looking great so far. They did show good form in qualifying last year and the sprint race, but I don't see them beating out Max and the McLarens this year. And then Mercedes the last few years here, apart from 2022, they haven't been amazing. Like they haven't been great. So I wouldn't really put Mercedes in the mix either. Um, so as you can see, Max goes up to 346 points, Lando on 375, and Oscar obviously closes the gap to Lando Nor sorry, ignore me. The gap increases between Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri to 4 points. So it's probably not the most consequential weekend this. Yes, Max Verstappen gains, but not by enough, not by the margins that you'd need for him to be a proper title contender. Like he needs more than this to happen with a 29-point gap. But then, of course, that leads you to what I think is most likely for Las Vegas next. And I think Mercedes are going to sweep this weekend, if I'm honest. And I know that's kind of recency bias based off of 2024, but you look at where Mercedes typically is strong recently. I know Singapore's an outlier, but this weekend just has Canada condition vibes written all over it. And I think Mercedes will be strong. And I think crucially for the context of the championship, you'll see Kimi Antonelli actually being in the mix and taking points off the McLarens. I think Max Verstappen will be pretty good here. Same with Ferrari, which is why I've put Norris and Piastri in a sixth and seventh sort of region, because that McLaren has never shown any signs of significant pace at Las Vegas in the last two runnings. So this will cause quite a big point swing. I think if looking at the last races, you should really pay attention to Las Vegas because I think this is the one where a big point swing is definitely on the cards, especially for Max Verstappen. And if this does happen, of course, it takes them up to 364 points. In theory, Norris and Piastri 383 and 377, and that brings the championship gap down to 19 points. And at this point, Max is properly in it. And whilst I haven't predicted it in the most likely scenario season, as I have these four races, I think it's very reasonable that if this is happening in real life, it's very likely that a DNF for Lando or Oscar is going to play on the minds of people. And like I say, I haven't factored it in because I'm doing this on the most likely scenario where everyone has a solid end to the season based off of current form. But when Max is now within a race win in this scenario, this is where it's going to really spice up because in the next, well, technically three races with a sprint race, any sort of McLaren DNF is going to be brutal and really brings either the other McLaren or Max Verstappen back into it. Um, so Vegas is going to be a very important one, but equally Qatar. I see a lot of people weighing up that this is going to be a McLaren dominant track, and I think you just need to regard last year. It's a strong track for McLaren, But Max Verstappen in that Red Bull that wasn't particularly great at the end of the season, he was pretty commanding this weekend, in 2024, as you can see by him qualifying on pole, which later got taken away, um, and the McLaren's only managing a third and a fourth. So that's why, with the nature of Qatar, I struggle to see much overtaking happening here, which again results in Max Verstappen getting pole, getting the win, and I do think we'll see a bit of a better bit of form of Oscar Piastri at Qatar, because you have to remember he got his first sprint win here in Qatar, and he's just generally been quite good here. I think the McLarens are very level between how I think they'll perform, but I do slightly tip Piastri to find something this weekend and beat out Norris, which, for the context of the championship, I mean, everything is incredibly close at this point. 389 for Verstappen, 395 for Piastri, 398 for Norris. I mean, that is incredible. A 9 point gap separating the top three going into Abu Dhabi. I think this is quite likely we see this, assuming that the Red Bull pace isn't just a flash in the pan and that Max does convert to the tracks that he should be good at. Um, so this sets up a pretty incredible Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, and we go to it. And unfortunately, for those who want a really tight championship battle, I do see Lando Norris comfortably winning this one, unfortunately. And as you can see, what that does to the championship, of course, he ends up winning it by quite a decent margin too. Because I think, based off of previous form, you have to consider McLaren being the favourites here. I think that's just reasonable. Ferrari also very strong contenders over the years at Abu Dhabi, which is why I've got Piastri in fourth, because I think his form still will be slightly dropped. I think Norris will be better in these last four races, and I think Charles Leclerc will just edge it out and take him off the podium, which does result in, yes, Norris winning the championship, but also we get a change in P2 in the championship due to countback with Max Verstappen having more second places over Oscar Piastri. So that's sort of what I foresee is the most probable future, disregarding DNFs, because, like I said, a DNF for any of these three drivers is going to shake it up, and I am going to go into that for my next two scenarios, because it does shake it up quite drastically, as you'd imagine. So I think most likely we're going to be seeing Lando Norris world champion at this current form and with these current races left on the calendar, but everything's still to play for. It ends the season with Verstappen and Piastri within a race win, so one DNF for Norris and a win for them, and they win the championship. So I think, whilst it does look probable for Norris, I still think it's going to be a really exciting end to the season, and as you can see, it ends it like that. But that leads into my second scenario, where we do sort of mix in a bit more misfortune for Norris. I think this last scenario is trying to be realistic about it, but kind of thinking about what would happen to the points if Norris hadn't had the best end of the season and Max Verstappen had the most optimal end to the season within reason. And as you can see, I think Brazil will end the same as, like I said in the last one, so not much needs to be said about the points here. I think it's going to be close between the top two. Obviously, in this scenario, in this future where Max Verstappen is having the most optimal end, of course Max is going to win this in this scenario. Um, so maybe this is like the crazy wet weather Sao Paulo race, where in this universe that I'm setting out in front of me, Max Verstappen just does a crazy drive like he did last year. So Brazil's not really a talking point, but what is going to Las Vegas, where I think if we were going to see a Lando Norris DNF, I think it probably would come here due to just the fact that I think McLaren will be back in the pack. He's DNF'd here before, and it just seems like a weekend that's not going to be particularly flattering for the McLaren car, which is why, of course, I've promoted Piastri to sixth. Verstappen will still finish second. I'm not doing this completely blindly on Verstappen winning everything. I think Mercedes will definitely be strong here and probably beat out Verstappen regardless. Um, but I think a P2 for Verstappen is quite reasonable here. And as you can see, the DNF to Norris, well, it gives you a new championship leader. Oscar Piastri in the lead with 379 points, Norris with 375, and Verstappen with 364, making the gap only 15 points between the top three. And if that doesn't whet your appetite for the last two races, if this sort of scenario does happen, then I don't know what you expect because going into Qatar, where again I will predict that Verstappen wins if this is optimal for him, he'll gain another 10 points on Norris and another 7 on Oscar, assuming that this is a reasonable podium. We've got rid of the misfortune of Norris DNFing. This is Norris recovering in the rest of the season, which is why I've kind of dipped his form a little bit. And sort of reinforced him finishing third here, because you have to imagine coming off after a DNF, the attitude or the mentality is potentially a bit damaged, and it makes it more likely, in my opinion, that Oscar Piastri is going to outperform him if Lando DNF'd in the previous race. So if Max wins this and Lando comes third, Oscar second, then the championship really spices up with Max in third on 389, Norris in second with 390, and Piastri still leading the championship with 397. And an 8 point gap between the top three going into Abu Dhabi. Well, anything's to play for. However, as I alluded to, this is the Max Verstappen simulation. So we get to Abu Dhabi, Max Verstappen pulls a blinder, wins the race ahead of Lando Norris in P2, and again, I'm predicting Charles Leclerc will be strong in P3. And this results in a Max Verstappen World Championship. I mean, there you go. This is the kind of levels of um, misfortune for McLaren that you'd need for Verstappen to win the championship. You need Oscar to be slightly off the pace. You can't have him second in every race, but also you need a Lando DNF and him coming second, third in other races. And I think this goes to show just how difficult it actually is for Max Verstappen. I mean, it's fun to hype up his chances, but I think for him to properly be in it, a DNF for Lando or Oscar is really needed because you can see here, I think it's reasonable to predict that, as I've done, the McLarens don't have an abysmal drop off in pace, and they're still going to be in strong point scoring positions. So, with that in consideration, you can see that even with a DNF for Lando and pretty average form for Piastri, Verstappen only wins it by 5 points. Like it's really difficult for him. And of course, the sprint races, I'm not including those, so it could be a bit closer, it could be a bit bigger. But 5 points between him and Piastri in second, and in 6 points between him and Norris in third. I mean, it just shows how tight the margins are. And Verstappen, as he said himself, needs this to go perfect, but also not just perfect in his own performance, but also perfect in a bit of poor luck for McLaren. Because without that Lando DNF, he'd win this by 2 points. And with Piastri having a bit better form, he'd win this by a couple points as well. So Verstappen's fate is really kind of on Ferrari and Mercedes on how much they can negate the points of the McLaren drivers, as you'd imagine. But I think, like I say, the most telling thing of that is that it's still incredibly close if you factor in a DNF for Norris and Verstappen winning three of the four races. And if this does happen, for all of the Verstappen fans out there, if this is the scenario where he wins the championship on the final race, then my word, what a season we've had. Like, that would be absolutely incredible to watch. And I do kind of hope this second scenario, whilst less likely than the first one, in my opinion, I think if this second one happened, it would be amazing. And I think a lot of us do want this to happen. Even if you are a McLaren fan, I think for the sake of the sport, it would be amazing to watch if this second scenario did happen. But for my last scenario, this is kind of the Oscar continues his poor form mixed with sort of realistic other teams getting in the mix. Like, it's not Max Verstappen destroying everyone, it's not Norris destroying everyone, but Mercedes and Ferrari play a bigger part. And what that does with a Oscar Piastri DNF in Brazil, well, that significantly loses him points to Norris, of course. And this is the other situation of Brazil where I do believe that, like I've said, it's interchangeable between Norris and Verstappen for who wins. And so in this scenario, I've given Lando Norris the victory in Brazil with Oscar DNFing because I believe with no contention from Oscar, it would naturally make it a bit easier for Norris to just focus on Max rather than Oscar if he's out of the race. So what that would do is Norris leads with 382 points, Piastri second on 356, and Verstappen in third with 339. And as you can instantly see here, the gap is not particularly nice to read between first and third. Like, it's by far not very close. And if this does happen, it's ominous for the next three races of the season, which of course then leads on to Qatar, sorry, Las Vegas, where again I'm consistent. I still think Mercedes will show up here. And I've kept the same positions for the McLaren drivers because I do believe Ferrari will be faster than them as well. And what that does to the championship is 390 for Norris, 362 for Piastri, and 357 for Verstappen. Which now you can see that the sort of complexion of the championship with sort of other teams getting in the mix, you can see that it is a close battle between Verstappen and Piastri for second, but Norris with that cushion kind of just extends his lead because with Piastri not performing, it makes it incredibly difficult for Verstappen to make up that gap on a Lando Norris who's doing well in these last four races. So I think if this does happen, we're going to be looking more at the gap, the battle for second, because then with Qatar, I do think Max will win this. I do genuinely believe that. Um, and I've kept the McLaren drivers in the same positions because it's unrealistic to completely write off Piastri. I don't think all four of these races Piastri is gonna have zero pace. I don't believe that. Um, but what that does is 405 for Norris, 380 for Piastri, but then Verstappen takes second place in the championship with 382 points, making the gap between second and first 23 points, and then 25 points between first and third. So I think this will drastically take the sting out of the final race because you'd only have a race win between the top three essentially, and you'd need Norris to DNF and Verstappen win. If we're taking this sort of scenario where Norris has a strong last three races and Verstappen isn't winning everything, I think we'll just see a really big gap for Norris heading into the last race, which, again, for this scenario where I'm saying the other teams will get in the mix, That's why I've gone for Ferrari winning at Abu Dhabi, whilst as unpredictable or unlikely as it is, uh, this is my how it will look if a different team does manage to get another win in these last four races. And I do believe Max Verstappen will finish runner-up and Norris third. And Piastri, if Ferrari do show up, I do think Hamilton will probably finish fourth as well. Hence why I've got Piastri in fifth. And what that does is, as you can imagine, Norris wins the championship with 420 points, Verstappen in second with 400, and Piastri all the way down in third with 390. And if, like I said, this scenario is kind of based on Piastri continuing to be mediocre and obviously Verstappen not winning everything. And if this does happen, which I think this is probably the second in terms of most likely, in my opinion. I think obviously the first one I talked about is what I believe will happen. But I do genuinely see Verstappen quite comfortably clearing Piastri for second in the championship. Just because Piastri's been off it. Like, if Ferrari, if Mercedes get in the mix, Piastri is not there to show up right now, and it is going to take points off of him. Unfortunately, the gap between Norris and Verstappen is too large that if Norris has a decent last few races, then he's going to win the championship anyways. And I know it might be disappointing to some people that the outlook of what all of these scenarios I've done here is Norris wins two of the championship scenarios quite comfortably. And the only sort of slightly unrealistic one is the Verstappen world champion case. I think you have to admit that this is what it's looking like. Whilst we all like to fantasize that this is going to be a three-way fight to the end, it's going to be really, really close. I think you just need to look on the form of Lando Norris, and this is what we should expect. Like, the McLaren is going to be strong in these last four races, barring Las Vegas, in my opinion. Um, and with that McLaren being strong, Norris is going to be there to deliver it, you'd assume. And Piastri might not, based off of how he's been driving at the moment. And that results in pretty comfortably Norris winning it. And like I say, it's disappointing that it's not going to be super, super close, but, without a bit of chaos, it's just probable that this will happen. I don't think Verstappen has absolute dominant form to win three of the last four races, like I've predicted in the second one, and to couple that with Norris having a terrible race in those last four. I just don't see that as being likely. And it would be incredible if that happened, but unfortunately, the first and third scenario is what I see happening. And that kind of is all that can be said about it. Of course, you can chuck in DNFs here, there, and everywhere, and you can try and manually manufacture a close championship, right? But it's just unrealistic to assume McLaren are going to DNF in two of these races, especially for the same driver. You can't bank on that for a championship fight. And you could even make a case that me predicting Verstappen winning Brazil and Qatar, you can easily make the case that one of the McLaren drivers wins those instead. And the gap will be even larger between first and third. So I think there's a lot to look forward to. And if we do get a Max Verstappen win in Brazil, then I think we're in the money at that point. Like, it's looking good if we get that happening, and we have McLaren not doing well at Vegas. But the main takeaway I will say is if McLaren are strong at Vegas, the championship's over. That's how I see it. Because Red Bull need McLaren to have a weak track, and historically that has been Las Vegas. But if they show up this year and they're comfortably the third, borderline second quickest car, then it's over for Verstappen, I think. And then it goes between Norris and Piastri, and I think Norris will still have the edge. So, a lot to decide, a lot to play for in the coming races, but I do ultimately see this is the end result of the championship, give or take some points because of the sprint race. Um, and yeah, if you're a Lando Norris fan, well, that's amazing because I do think he looks the most likely to be world champion. Just if he stays consistent, which is what you'd have to assume will happen. Um, and no matter what Verstappen does, if he wins everything and Norris is consistent, he has no chance. And unfortunately, Oscar's just not been performing well. So momentum is heavily with Lando Norris, and that's why I've put it as Norris wins the championship with Verstappen in second and Oscar Piastri in third. And let me know in the comments what you think about that. Let me know any more scenarios that you think might happen, because I think th so many things can happen between the lights out in Brazil and the checkered flag in Abu Dhabi, but I think it is too easy to get away with ourselves in fantasizing all of the craziness that could happen, but rather bring ourselves back down to reality and realize that in theory a 36-point gap should be comfortable for Norris, and it really should. So that's my thoughts on it. That's what I believe will likely happen in the coming races. So yeah, if you enjoyed, please like and subscribe, and I will be back for more content in the future. Um, Hopefully before Brazil, if not for Brazil. And I hope everyone has a nice rest of their day, and I'll see you next time. Thank you very much. Goodbye.